After winning the election, President Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi told Egyptians it is now time to work to rebuild the economy. Joining us now from the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma is Dr. Shehata. He's a specialist in Egyptian politics and the Muslim Brotherhood. Dr. Shehata, thanks for joining us. When we look at
My pleasure.
We look at the situation in Egypt right now. We have power cuts or blackouts every day, up to 6 of them, some of them lasting about 2 hours. The country's energy corporation is deep in debt. Half the country lives either below the poverty line or just above the poverty line. How did Egypt get to this state?
Well, over many, many years. I mean, of course, Egypt in the 1950s and 60s lived under a socialist government, and there was, of course, tremendous waste in addition to positive benefits as well. There's been an increase in the population that has really pushed the limits of the infrastructure, whether it's electricity or water usage or even arable land and so on. And so we've seen in Egypt increasing population with the same or decreasing amount of resources, and that is what's led to this primarily, in addition to bad governance. Authoritarian regimes have proven not to be good in terms of governance, much worse than democratic regimes because there's little accountability. So when you add all of these things along with a significant amount of corruption, I think you get to the current state.
Right, formidable challenges that you talk about there. Is this current government under al-Sisi capable of fixing this? Are they up to the task?
Well, I think no government in Egypt, any government one could imagine, would find the challenges quite daunting because wherever you look, there are serious crises, whether it's education, health, infrastructure, as I said, a bloated civil service and government employees and so on. Not as much foreign investment, of course, because of the political turbulence and tumult, and a very divided polity. So I think that the current regime, President al-Sisi, is going to have a difficult time. Now, there has been some support from some external actors, supporters of the current regime, namely Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, and so on. But I think even with that help, it'll be difficult to really make a qualitative change in Egypt's political economy and the quality of living for many people in the years to come.
I want to just get back to one point you mentioned there, and that is political turbulence in the country. The Muslim Brotherhood, one of the biggest parties in Egypt, it's been outlawed, its leaders have been imprisoned, its members have been imprisoned as well, some of them have been killed. To what extent is that contributing to political instability in Egypt?
Well, I think that is the primary reason there is political instability in Egypt. You'll remember that in the summer of 2013, actually on July 3rd, 2013, there was a military coup, a popularly backed military coup, with millions of people getting on the streets and asking for the president to step down, but nonetheless a military coup led by, at the time, General abdel-Fattah al-Sisi. The country was divided before this, but it's become even more divided and polarized since that time. So, yes, I think the events of last summer, the ousting of President Morsi, Egypt's first democratically elected president, the violence subsequently, the political repression that the country has seen and so on, all of this has contributed to turbulent politics, instability, and also makes the country less attractive as a site for tourists. The country is dependent on tourism revenue as one of the main sources of external earnings and so on, hard currency, and also less attractive as a site for foreign investment. So yes, that's contributed to, of course, the political situation and the security situation, as well as the economic difficulties.
And you mentioned the main financial supporters of Egypt, countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. They're pouring billions of dollars into Egypt. How long can they continue doing that?
Well, I think that's a very good question. They, of course, are supporters of the current regime. They are opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I should say opponents of democracy in the region generally, in Egypt and elsewhere, because it threatens them. But, as you implied, they have limited resources as well, and they will not go on forever spending or pouring billions of dollars into Egypt without any kind of return. So we've seen, initially, we've seen about $15–16 billion put in by those three countries. I think it's less likely that we're going to see that level of economic support in the future. But we are going to see them still try to support this government as much as they can.
And in terms of what they're expecting in return, I mean, politically, what do they expect for this financial largesse, if I could call it that?
Yes, well, they expect a number of things politically. I think, firstly, as I mentioned, they were opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were opponents also and have been opponents of democracy in the region, particularly since the Arab uprisings began in 2011 in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere. Of course, they want to remain in power, and these are non-democratic, non-elected, monarchical regimes. So that's the first thing that they get. The ouster of the Brotherhood and the installation of a military regime that is friendly to them and friendly to their interests. The second thing they get is a regime that, for the most part, backs their interests in the region, whether it is vis-a-vis Iran and the difficulties and the tension vis-a-vis Iran between these Arab states, or their policies elsewhere in the region, Libya, Syria, and so on. So support for their foreign policies, I think, secondly, is quite important as well.
Right, talking about foreign policy, and I want to get to this question before we run out of time. Given Egypt's role in the recent Gaza war and trying to get to that agreement, that truce agreement that we've heard a lot about, despite its economic problems, despite its political problems, does Egypt still have a great deal of diplomatic clout in the Arab world?
Egypt's diplomatic clout has decreased significantly, I think, since the 1970s and 80s. That, and also it needs to be said that has mirrored Egypt's economic decline, and it's also reflected or paralleled with the rise of other powers in the region. Some of the Arab Gulf states buoyed as a result of oil and natural gas wealth and so on. At the same time, Egypt is still the most populous country in the Arab world. If something happens in Egypt, it has an impact on politics elsewhere. So yes, Egypt is still important, and of course, Egypt is important particularly with regard to the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for a number of reasons. Egypt is a border state, of course. It has a border with Israel, a border with Gaza. It was the first country to have a peace accord with Israel, and of course, Hamas is related in some senses to the Muslim Brotherhood. So all of these things make Egypt an important regional player, but particularly important in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Dr. Shehata, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us, sir. We are going to take a break right now. Next, we'll continue our discussion about Egypt with a former spokesperson for President Morsi and an Islamic thinker and reformer. You're on The Heat. Stay with us.